In an astonishing and life-altering experience, a pastor claims to have died and witnessed a harrowing vision of hell on earth in 2025. In this profound testimony, he describes a future marked by immense suffering, where women and children are left starving in a bleak and desperate world. What he saw serves as a chilling warning of the potential consequences if humanity continues on its current path. Here is the story of the pastor who died and came back to life with some terrifying news. Let's begin. I can remember the exact moment it happened. 1 minute, I was living my life, doing what I did every day, and the next, I was no longer here. I had passed away. There's no easy way to describe the feeling. It wasn't like I was fighting or struggling, it was just a sudden shift. I remember my body feeling weightless, as though I was slipping out of it, like an old coat that no longer fit. I felt my spirit being pulled from my physical form, leaving the pain and weariness of life behind. The transition itself was strange. It wasn't like the world went dark or quiet. There was no blinding light or overwhelming sense of peace, as many people describe in near-death experiences. It was more like stepping out of a room and into a completely different space. Like going through a door that wasn't visible until I reached it. And when I crossed that threshold, I realized something profound. I was no longer tethered to the world I'd known. At first, I didn't understand where I was or what was happening. I felt a sense of floating, as though I was suspended in a vast, uncharted space, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was detached. I could still think, still feel emotions, but the sense of physicality, of touch, of weight, was gone. Then, suddenly, everything shifted. I felt myself moving, but not with my own volition. It was as if an unseen force had grabbed hold of me, pulling me along, guiding me. I wasn't sure where I was going, but I didn't resist. There was no fear. Instead, I felt calm. At that moment, I had no comprehension of time, no awareness of the length of the journey. But then, I saw it. I was thrust into a vision, one that was far more real than any dream or imagination could be. I found myself standing on what looked like a desolate wasteland. It wasn't a place I recognized, nor did it resemble anything from my earthly experiences. The air was thick and the ground was cracked, dry and barren. I could see smoke rising from the distance, clouds of ash swirling like a storm in the sky. The land was empty, void of any life, save for scattered figures moving slowly across the barren landscape. I could feel their hunger, almost like a palpable physical presence. It was a gnawing, aching hunger that seemed to penetrate every being on that land. These figures, thin and gaunt, looked desperate, as if they were scraping for any scrap of sustenance they could find. And it wasn't just hunger in the physical sense. It was as though their spirits were starving too. They were lost, hollowed out from the inside, as if something essential had been taken from them. I watched them move, their eyes dull and lifeless, some barely able to stand. It wasn't just a hunger for food. It was a hunger for hope, for connection, for purpose. But there was nothing. The land offered no comfort, no solace, no relief. It was as if they were caught in a perpetual state of thirst for life, for meaning, for something that could fill the emptiness that had overtaken them. The women and children stood out to me the most. The women, in particular, seemed to carry a burden I could hardly comprehend. Their faces were hollow with exhaustion, their hands trembling as they held their children. I saw mothers trying desperately to comfort their little ones, but their arms were empty, their eyes defeated. These children too young to understand, seemed to carry the same hollow look as their mothers. They cried, but their tears were too dry to be seen. They were no longer crying for the sake of release, but because their spirits had been broken. They seemed to know they were in a place where no comfort could reach them. In that moment, I realized the depth of their suffering. It wasn't just physical starvation. It was a complete depletion of life. It was as though everything that made them human had been drained, leaving only shells of people, wandering in a landscape that mirrored their inner desolation. There was no escape, no hope in sight. Only endless suffering. And yet, amid this devastation, I felt a deep sense of sadness, not for them, but for the world I had come from. I realized that this vision wasn't just a depiction of suffering, it was a glimpse into a future that could unfold. It wasn't a certainty, but a possibility. It was a warning. What had happened here, in this place, could come to pass if humanity didn't change. It was as though the earth itself was bearing witness to the consequences of a world that had lost its way, where the most vulnerable were left to wither and die. I didn't understand why I had been shown this. It wasn't a dream, and it wasn't just a vision. It was too real, too vivid. The hunger, the pain, the hopelessness. It felt like a weight pressing on my soul. I could still feel it even as the vision began to fade. As I returned to myself, to my earthly body, I carried that vision with me. The gravity of what I had seen didn't lift when I woke up. Instead, it left me with an overwhelming sense of responsibility. What I had seen, that suffering and desperation, was not just some distant event. It was a possibility, one that was already on the horizon. I couldn't ignore it. And I knew that my experience had a purpose, to share it, to warn others, and to urge change before it was too late. The scene that unfolded before me in that moment was one I could never have imagined in my worst nightmares. I thought I had seen suffering before, but this was something beyond comprehension. The world I saw stretched before me was like nothing I had ever known. It was desolate, a wasteland. The very earth seemed to have given up, as if the land itself was parched, its spirit broken. There were no trees, no animals, nothing that spoke of life in the way we understand it. The air was thick, heavy with the weight of something dreadful, a suffocating oppression that hung in the atmosphere, like a smog that choked all hope from the land. The colors were muted, as though the vibrancy of the world had been drained away. I couldn't remember the last time I had seen such a place. There was no hint of green, no patch of blue sky. The sun hung low, a dark red ball that did nothing to illuminate the world beneath it, but only cast shadows that stretched too long, too menacing. The very ground beneath me felt wrong. It cracked and groaned underfoot, as if it too was weary of existence. I had no sense of direction, no sense of where I was or why I was there. All I knew was that I was standing in the middle of a place of unrelenting suffering. As I stood there, I began to notice the figures moving around me. At first, I thought I had seen shadows, but as they came closer, I realized they were people, souls, as I now know. They were not walking, not with purpose, but dragging their bodies as if they were tethered to the ground, unable to move freely. Their faces were hollow, as though they had been drained of all vitality, their eyes sunken and clouded with despair. They walked aimlessly, some stumbling, others leaning on broken sticks or anything they could find to support themselves. They seemed unaware of each other, each soul locked within their own private torment. There was no communication between them, no conversation, no exchange of glances, just silent, slow, suffering. What struck me first was the hunger. It wasn't just the physical hunger for food, it was a spiritual hunger, a gnawing emptiness that seemed to devour everything it touched. These people weren't simply starving for food, but for something far deeper: meaning, hope, purpose. It was as if they had lost everything that made them human. I saw women who should have been caring for their children, but instead, they wandered in a trance, their hands trembling at their sides. They didn't reach out for one another. They didn't even look at each other. There was no compassion. There was no empathy. It was as though every bit of goodness had been drained from them, and they were mere shells, walking through a world devoid of life. And the children, oh, the children, they were the most haunting of all. Their faces were thin, drawn, the bones beneath their skin visible through their frail bodies. They had wide, empty eyes that seemed to reflect nothing but the vast, unforgiving landscape around them. I could hear the faint cries of some, but they were so weak, so devoid of energy, that it was hard to tell if they were really crying or if the sound was just an echo of despair. These children, who should have been full of life and energy, were but shadows of their former selves, their tiny hands reaching out for something that wasn't there. I saw a mother, her face gaunt and weary, holding her child in her arms, but there was no warmth, no tenderness in her embrace. She looked at the child, but her eyes were empty, as if she didn't even recognize her own flesh and blood. The child, too weak to even cry, rested limply against her, his tiny chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. I couldn't understand what had happened to them. What kind of world would allow this? How could something like this be allowed to exist? And yet, I knew this place wasn't some random tragedy. It was a vision, a glimpse into a potential future. I could feel it in my spirit. This wasn't just a nightmare. This was a warning. I could see the desperation in their eyes, and it wasn't just the hunger that was killing them, it was the hopelessness. The world around them had abandoned them. There was no longer any compassion, no love, no care. Everything that could nourish the human soul had been stripped away. The silence was deafening. It was an oppressive quiet, broken only by the faintest sound of movement, the creak of the parched earth beneath their feet, the soft scrape of their shoes against the cracked ground. No birds, no rustling of trees, no distant murmur of life. Just the endless stretch of an empty, dying world. I couldn't understand how this was happening. Why were they there? Why were they suffering like this? What had happened to their world? It was as if they were living in the aftermath of some great collapse, a world that had been torn apart by greed, hatred, and neglect. A world where the basic needs of its people were no longer met, where the most vulnerable were cast aside and forgotten. But the more I looked, the more I realized the most disturbing thing of all. These people weren't just survivors of a collapse, they were the product of it. They weren't living in some post-apocalyptic wasteland. They were the result of a moral and spiritual decay that had spread like a disease across the earth. This wasn't just about food or physical survival. It was about a world that had turned its back on its own humanity. It was a warning of what could happen if we continued to ignore the needs of the most vulnerable among us. A future where selfishness, greed, and indifference could leave the innocent to perish. And as I stood there, feeling the weight of the vision press down on me, I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't some distant, abstract future. This was a path we were already on. The world I had left behind was inching closer to this fate every day. The suffering I saw wasn't just a possibility. It was an inevitability if humanity didn't change course. I could feel it in the very air of that place. The suffering, the starvation, the hopelessness. It was all waiting just around the corner. And if we didn't act, if we didn't change, this future was going to become a reality. I couldn't look away. The faces of the suffering, the hollow eyes of the children, the desperation of the mothers, it all haunted me. It still does. Every moment since that vision has been filled with the weight of that responsibility. And I know that I can't ignore it. I can't let this fate befall the world I love. I have to speak. I have to share what I've seen, because the people I saw in that vision, they were real. They were us, and they are waiting for us to listen. The most heart-wrenching part of what I saw, the part that has never left me, was the sheer desperation of those who were starving. It wasn't just the physical appearance of hunger, it was the way it consumed their every thought, every movement. I watched them as they dragged their bodies across the cracked, barren earth, each step an exhausting effort. They were not walking with purpose. They were surviving by instinct, moving only because their bodies demanded it. But even then, it wasn't living. It was a struggle for existence in the most primal sense, a battle where survival was no longer something to be celebrated, but something to be feared. The hunger I witnessed wasn't just for food. It was an insatiable hunger that gnawed at the very core of these people, as if something inside them had been hollowed out. I could see it in their eyes, the emptiness. They weren't just hungry for sustenance, they were hungry for life itself, for meaning, for hope. It was as though every ounce of joy, every spark of human connection had been drained away, leaving only a vast, unfillable void. And yet, there was no food to be found, no scraps, nothing. The ground was barren. There was no evidence of crops or animals. It was as though the earth itself had abandoned them, leaving them to wither and die. And I remember thinking, how had they come to this? How had this world come to a place where food, the most basic of human needs, had become so scarce that people were left to wander aimlessly, hoping for a miracle that would never come? I saw one woman, thin to the point of being skeletal, crouched beside a broken stone. Her face was covered in dirt, and her clothes hung from her frame like rags. She held her child, barely more than a wisp of a body, against her chest, trying to keep them both warm. But there was no warmth, there was no shelter. The child's body was limp, too weak to cry, too weak to do anything but exist. The woman's eyes, empty, distant, looked out across the barren landscape as if waiting for something that would never come. She tried to feed her child, but there was nothing. The child's mouth moved in a faint, pitiful motion, but there was no food, no comfort. Just the desperate, hollow motions of survival. I saw children trying to drink from what seemed to be a stagnant pool of water, their hands shaking as they cupped the water to their lips. But it wasn't clean water. It was tainted, murky, and probably filled with disease. They didn't care. They were so desperate that they drank without hesitation, not even knowing whether it would bring them relief or further harm. All they wanted was something to fill the emptiness inside them. But the more they drank, the more they seemed to fade away, like the water was pulling the life out of them, leaving them weaker, thinner, more fragile. It wasn't just about the children, though. It was the way the hunger spread across everyone. It affected everyone, young and old, male and female. The older people moved slower, their limbs stiff and frail. Their faces etched with lines of pain and sorrow. They didn't have the energy to fight the hunger as the younger ones did. They had already given everything they had. And now they were just waiting for the inevitable. There was no dignity in their movements. There was no hope left in their eyes. They were simply existing in a state of perpetual, unyielding torment. And in all of this, there was no compassion, no sense of community. There were no families coming together to help one another, no strangers offering comfort or aid. Everyone was too consumed by their own hunger, their own pain, to care for anyone else. The very act of survival had become so all-consuming that there was no space left for anything else. There was no room for kindness or empathy. There was only a desperate, instinctive fight to survive, no matter the cost. I remember one woman, her face gaunt and hollow, walking slowly across the landscape. She held her child's limp body in her arms, as if she was carrying a precious treasure, but it wasn't. There was no life left in the child. The woman's face was blank, her expression empty, but I could sense that she had already given up. She was just walking aimlessly, with no purpose but to move, because her body still functioned. Her eyes were vacant, distant, staring into nothingness. And that was the most terrifying part of it all, the hopelessness in her eyes, the way she no longer seemed human. She was just a shell, a body that had been stripped of everything that made her who she was. And she was not alone. Everywhere I looked, I saw the same empty eyes, the same hollow faces. I realized in that moment that this hunger, this suffering, was not just a physical condition. It was something deeper, something more spiritual. It was as if the very essence of these people had been starved, their souls drained of everything that gave them life. The hunger wasn't just for food. It was for love, for connection, for meaning. It was for the things that make us human. And in this place, in this vision of hell, there was none of that left. There was only survival, but even that survival seemed to be slipping away. I stood there, frozen in the reality of what I was witnessing. The images of the starving, of the desperate mothers and children, would not leave me. Even when I returned to my body, even when I came back to my life, those images remained burned into my mind. I couldn't forget the hollow faces, the empty eyes, the endless hunger that gnawed at everyone I had seen. The world I had seen wasn't just a warning. It was a reflection of a reality that could unfold if we continued down the path we were on. It was as if the earth itself was pleading for us to wake up, to care for those who were already suffering, to stop ignoring the hungry, the desperate, the broken. Because if we didn't, if we allowed this to continue, this vision of suffering could become a reality for all of us. And that is something I can never forget. The more I witnessed, the more I understood how interconnected everything was in this bleak vision of the future. It wasn't just the hunger that was destroying them. It was the profound sense of despair that had settled in their hearts, a hopelessness so deep that it was as if the very concept of joy had been erased from existence. These people weren't just suffering from physical deprivation. They were starving for the simple things that give life meaning: love, hope, connection. I saw entire families, if you could still call them families, walking through the dust. Fathers dragging their feet, mothers holding their children tightly against them, but the bond between them wasn't what it should have been. The children, once so full of life and energy, now seemed like old souls trapped in young bodies. There was no play, no laughter. There was no warmth in their embrace. They were all just moving through the world like shadows, desperately clinging to each other for any small semblance of comfort. But there was no real connection anymore. There was only survival, and survival had become a cold, brutal necessity. I remember one scene that haunts me, and I can't seem to shake it. A father and his young son, no older than 6 or 7, were trudging through the barren land. The father's face was sunken, his body hunched from exhaustion. His eyes, when he glanced at his son, were filled with nothing but emptiness, as though he had already resigned himself to the fact that they both might not make it. The child, small and weak, staggered beside him, his little feet barely lifting off the ground. He didn't ask for food, didn't cry. There was no energy left for such things. His small hand clutched weakly at his father's side, and for a moment I thought the father might collapse. But he didn't. He simply kept moving forward, one step at a time. What struck me the hardest about this scene was the utter lack of hope. It was as if the will to live had been extinguished from their hearts. They were alive in the physical sense, but they were not living. They were enduring, they were existing in a perpetual state of exhaustion and suffering, walking through life like automatons, their minds numbed to the horror around them. They didn't talk to each other. They didn't look at each other. They didn't share any comforting words or gestures. They were each lost in their own world of pain, too consumed by it to connect. There was no love in the air, no laughter, no companionship, just the sound of footsteps in the dust and the silence of hopelessness. And it wasn't just the individuals, it was the entire landscape that reflected this desolation. The world around them mirrored their inner despair. The air was heavy and oppressive, thick with the weight of years of suffering. It was as if the earth itself had grown tired of giving, tired of nurturing, and now it was taking. There were no sounds of life, no birds, no insects, no rustling of trees. The air was still, lifeless, suffocating. And even the few signs of life I saw, sparse, shriveled plants, seemed to be barely holding on, clinging to the earth like the people around them. I tried to understand how it had come to this. How had the world become so broken? It wasn't just about a lack of resources or war or disease. Those things were certainly present, but they were the symptoms, not the cause. The real problem, the thing that had caused the devastation I was witnessing, was a profound spiritual decay. It was as though humanity had turned away from everything that made life worth living. The values that should have bound them together, love, compassion, community, had all but disappeared. What remained was a cold, heartless existence where every person was left to fend for themselves, too tired and too broken to care for others. As I watched this scene unfold, I felt an overwhelming sense of responsibility. I realized that this wasn't just a vision, some far-off nightmare. This was a warning, and it was not something that would only happen in some distant future. It was already starting. The seeds of this desolation had already been sown in the world I had left behind. We were heading down a path that could very easily lead to the kind of suffering I had witnessed. I saw the same signs in our world: the breakdown of communities, the growing divide between the rich and the poor, the erosion of compassion, and the increasing disconnection between people. The way we had begun to prioritize ourselves, our desires, and our comforts over the well-being of others was beginning to take its toll. It was hard to admit, but the truth was clear. We were on the brink. The vision I had seen was not just a glimpse of a future that could be avoided. It was a mirror of the path we were already on. We were, in many ways, already starving. We were starving for connection, for love, for meaning. We had become so consumed with our own desires, our own survival, that we had lost sight of the things that truly matter. As I left the vision behind and returned to my body, I was shaken to the core. The hunger I had seen was not just a physical condition, it was a spiritual one, a hunger that could only be satisfied by returning to what made us human. We had to find our way back to each other. We had to stop living in isolation, stop turning our backs on the most vulnerable, and start rebuilding the bonds that held us together as a society. If we didn't, the hunger, the despair, the emptiness I had witnessed could very well become our own reality. And I knew that I couldn't let that happen. I had to speak out. I had to share what I had seen, because it wasn't just about food. It was about a famine of the heart. A famine that could be avoided if we changed our course before it was too late. The scene that unfolded in front of me was more than just a vision. It was a wake-up call. I could feel it deep in my bones. This was not just about seeing suffering. This was about understanding the deeper causes of it, the spiritual decay that allowed such devastation to unfold. It became clear to me in those moments that we, as humanity, were walking a dangerous path. And the consequences of continuing in the direction we were headed would be far worse than anyone could imagine. I had seen the physical suffering, the hunger, the isolation, the hopelessness, but the true depth of the destruction went far beyond what the eye could see. The people in that place were not only starving for food, they were starving for meaning, for purpose, for connection. They were devoid of love, compassion, and community. The very things that make us human had been stripped away from them. And that was the scariest part. The realization that we, as a society, were moving toward the same fate. A slow, spiritual death that would leave us empty shells, disconnected and without hope. What struck me even more was that this was not just some isolated event. This wasn't a vision of a distant future or some small group of people in a far-off land. The hunger I saw, the despair, it was all around me, even now. I had to ask myself, how had we allowed this to happen? How had we, as a species, gotten so far off track that this kind of suffering was becoming a reality? The truth, I realized, was that we had become too focused on our own survival, on our own desires and comforts, to see the suffering of others. We had created a world that was built on selfishness, greed, and indifference. We had built systems that prioritized profit over people, wealth over welfare. And in doing so, we had allowed the most vulnerable among us to be neglected, to be forgotten, to starve, not just for food, but for the basic human dignity and care that every person deserves. It was clear to me that this world I had seen in my vision wasn't a result of natural disasters or some inevitable catastrophe. No, it was the consequence of our choices. It was the result of a broken, fractured world where love and compassion had been replaced by indifference. It was the outcome of generations of neglect, of turning a blind eye to the needs of others, of prioritizing our own comfort over the well-being of the most vulnerable. And as I stood there, wrestling with the enormity of what I had witnessed, I realized that the hunger and suffering I had seen were only the beginning. The true devastation would come when people lost their sense of humanity altogether. When we became so consumed by our own survival that we no longer cared about each other. When the very essence of community, of empathy, was stripped away, leaving only hollow, empty shells of what we once were. The fear of that future gripped me like nothing I had ever experienced. But it wasn't just fear. It was a deep, aching sorrow. Because I knew that we had the power to change this. We had the power to stop it, to shift the course of our collective future. But it would take effort, it would take sacrifice, and it would take a collective willingness to put aside our differences, our selfishness, and to care for one another, to rebuild the connections that had been lost, to show love where there had been none, to prioritize compassion over competition. I could feel the weight of that responsibility pressing down on me, and I knew that I couldn't ignore it. What I had seen in that vision was a warning, a loud, urgent call to wake up, to stop the destruction before it was too late. The future that I had seen wasn't inevitable. It was a path, and we still had the choice to turn away from it. But if we didn't act, if we didn't start caring for each other, if we didn't put the needs of others above our own, then that world I had seen would become our reality. I'd been given this glimpse of what could happen, but now it was my responsibility to share it, to wake others up to the danger we were facing. Because if we didn't make a change, if we didn't learn to live with love, empathy, and compassion, then we would all find ourselves starving, not just for food, but for the things that truly make life worth living. I can't forget the faces I saw, the people, the children, the parents, their hollow eyes, their broken spirits. They were not just images in my mind. They were a reality waiting to happen. And now it was up to us to make sure it never did. To build a world where love, community, and kindness are not just ideals, but the very foundation of everything we do. Because if we don't, then the hunger, the emptiness, the despair I saw will be all we have left. In an astonishing and life-altering experience, a pastor claims to have died and witnessed a harrowing vision of hell on earth in 2025. In this profound testimony, he describes a future marked by immense suffering, where women and children are left starving in a bleak and desperate world. What he saw serves as a chilling warning of the potential consequences if humanity continues on its current path. This video takes you through his gripping account, exploring what he believes is in store for us.